This aggressive police dog was labeled hopeless, but love spoke in silence. Kyros had a file as thick as a phone book. Former K9. Failed out. Dangerous, one report read. Unreachable, said another. Chained in an abandoned barn before being dumped at a shelter, his future narrowed to a locked cage and weekly sedation. He lunged at anyone who came close, except one girl who didn't try. She didn't offer treats, she didn't speak, she just sat. And in that stillness, something stirred. Not obedience, not submission, but memory. Because Kyros wasn't angry. He was hurt. And someone finally saw the difference. The shelter smelled of antiseptic and old rain clean, but not comforting. On cold days like this, the air hung low with moisture, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting dull reflections against metal bars that lined the corridor like narrow hallways of forgotten lives. Tails thumped against kennel doors, muzzles pressed through gaps, sniffing for something. Hope, maybe. Some barked the moment a footstep echoed down the tile. Others whined with practiced desperation, eyes pleading for second chances. But in the far left corner of the shelter, the cage that staff called the quiet cell, there was only silence. There, where the flickering light didn't quite reach, lay a German shepherd who no longer begged. His name was Kyros, or at least that's what they called him. No collar, no chip, no papers. Just scars where a badge used to sit, and a look in his eyes that said, "Don't come closer." He wasn't sleeping. He never truly slept. He watched. Eyes open, shoulders taut, even while lying down, Kyros curled his large frame into the smallest possible space, like a creature trying to disappear into concrete. His fur, once likely sleek and burnished, now dulled and patchy, clung to a frame that had clearly once known discipline, power, and routine. But that was before the leash had disappeared, before the uniformed handler that once walked beside him stopped coming, before the screams, the steel gate, the cage. A printed sign hung from the gate. Do not approach. Bite risk. Staff entry by authorization only. Even the most seasoned handlers no longer challenged it. Trish, the shelter manager, had once tried to remove it, just to see if it helped. But after a young intern lingered too long near the kennel one evening, and Kyros launched at the bars with a guttural roar that shook the steel frame, she replaced the sign. This time, in red. No one blamed him, not really, but no one tried again either. Used to be a K9, I heard, one volunteer whispered to another. Worked narcotics or something. Nah, tactical. You can tell by the way he tracks those eyes. They don't blink. Well, he's not tracking anymore. He's just waiting. That part, at least, was true. Kyros didn't bark for attention. He didn't wag his tail. When someone passed, he didn't press his nose to the bars. He simply observed, like a soldier stationed on the wrong battlefield, with no orders left to follow. If a man walked by, especially a man in uniform or heavy boots, Kyros would shift. Sometimes it was a subtle lift of the head, other times a deep, throat-borne growl that reverberated from his ribs. If the person lingered too long, the growl would erupt into a lunge front pause, slamming into the gate, teeth bared, eyes wide with fury. But it wasn't rage. Not really. It was fear dressed in the only language he had left. He had been found 9 months earlier, chained behind an abandoned barn on the outskirts of Echo Creek. The farmer who stumbled upon him said he thought it was a pile of trash at first, until the pile growled. Animal control found him with a heavy collar embedded in his skin, ribs sharp against leathery skin, and eyes that refused to look directly at anyone. He didn't bite the officers, But he didn't flinch when the catchpole slipped around his neck either. Just followed, silent, like he already knew the routine. They brought him to the shelter, gave him a name, fed him, treated the infection, updated his shots. But no matter how many weeks passed, Kyros stayed folded into himself. His kennel had become a fortress, a place of snarls and silence. Staff tried to rotate volunteers to sit with him, but most gave up after 1 or 2 attempts. He refused toys, ignored treats, growled at men. With women, he tolerated proximity sometimes, but never affection. "Hopeless case," one vet had said after 3 months. "He's trained for control, and when that broke, so did he." Yet Trish couldn't bring herself to give the order for transfer to a long-term facility. Something in Kyros, some flicker of unfinished story, made her hesitate. So he remained, in the cage at the end of the row, the one no one visited unless they had to, the one the new volunteers whispered about with a mix of fear and pity. But still, every morning when Trish did her rounds, she stopped at his cage just a little longer, set down the bowl gently, spoke quietly, even when she knew he wouldn't respond. "Morning, big guy," she said one Thursday, voice soft as the dawn light leaking through the high window. Kyros didn't move, but one ear flicked. That was something. She knelt briefly, not close, just near enough that her breath fogged the glass wall next to the bars. "They say you're broken, but I've seen broken. You're not that. You're waiting for something, or someone." Kyros didn't blink. He just watched. Later that day, 2 new visitors would enter the shelter. 1 woman, 1 child. Neither came to adopt. Neither came looking for a shepherd. But Kyros, coiled in the corner of his fortress, would lift his head for the first time in weeks, and the silence between cages would start to shift. Elena Carter hadn't planned on staying long. She wasn't here to adopt, wasn't here to heal anyone, wasn't even sure why she said yes when her colleague Melanie asked if she'd tag along to the Echo Creek shelter. Something about needing a second opinion on a Labrador mix she was eyeing. Elena had agreed half-heartedly, more out of politeness than purpose. A rare free Saturday. No patient charts. No trauma sessions. Just her, Mira, and a coffee cup still warm between her palms. She parked by the gravel lot as the early November wind tugged at the edges of her coat. Mira slid out of the passenger seat without a word, her sketch pad clutched to her chest, like always. At 10, Mira had the quiet watchfulness of a child who noticed everything and said very little. Inside, the shelter's air was warm but tired, an odd combination of cleaning fluid and wet fur, joy and resignation. Melanie disappeared down the row to find the dog she'd come for, already chatting up a staffer. Elena let her go. "I'll stay out of the way," she told the woman at the front desk. She wasn't sure if she meant physically or emotionally. Mira walked ahead, her small boots making soft scuffs against the concrete. One by one, she passed the kennels offering tiny smiles to each dog. Some barked, some wagged. One puppy spun in circles so fast he crashed into the wall. Mira giggled once, but kept moving. Then she stopped. Elena didn't see what caught her attention at first. Mira had halted at the far end of the hallway, body still, sketch pad now pressed tightly to her chest. Elena stepped forward slowly, letting her daughter take the lead, instinct guiding her as it always did in uncertain emotional spaces. It was the cage in the corner, the one everyone else had avoided. Even from 10 feet away, Elena could feel it. That dense, coiled energy in the air, the kind that told you not to speak above a whisper. the kind that warned, "This moment matters." Mira didn't move. Kyros was there, just as Trish had described in passing weeks ago, large, still, a hushed animal presence that felt more like a shadow than a dog. He didn't growl, didn't lunge. He just watched, eyes locked onto Mira with a kind of tension that wasn't threat, but wasn't peace either. Elena stood behind her daughter, not stepping closer. Her hand rested lightly on Mira's shoulder. Her training told her to assess body posture, tail position, breathing patterns. But none of that mattered right now, because in that moment, Kyros blinked. Not a slow blink of contentment, not the rapid flicker of fear. Just one deliberate blink, like he was testing the edges of what was real. Mira lowered her sketchpad slightly. Her voice was barely a murmur. "He's not angry," she said. "He just doesn't believe we're real yet." Elena felt something pulled tight inside her chest. Not fear, not even concern. Recognition. It wasn't the dog's eyes that struck her most. It was what they didn't hold. No challenge, no curiosity, just this exhausted kind of guard. As if everything soft in him had been filed down to survival. She knew that look, had seen it in combat veterans, in children who flinched when you opened a door too fast, in her own reflection once, years ago, when the world had turned too loud. Elena crouched, not too close, just enough to match her daughter's eye line. Mira didn't speak again. She simply sat, knees drawn to her chest, head tilted slightly as if trying to make herself smaller, less threatening. Inside the kennel, Kyros didn't move, but his breathing changed. Slower, shallower, still cautious. A noise echoed from the front of the shelter. Someone dropping a clipboard, and Elena saw the flicker. Kyros's body twitched, tense, like an invisible wire had just been pulled. But he didn't rise, didn't growl. He just watched. Elena whispered to Mira, without taking her eyes off the dog. "You feel safe?" Mira nodded. "And him?" Another pause. "Not yet. But he's listening." From behind them, a voice approached gently. "I see you found our resident mystery." It was Trish, shelter manager, holding a clipboard and wearing the same knowing look Elena often carried in session, half compassion, half emotional triage. "I thought he was in quarantine," Elena said softly. "He is, sort of. We just don't have the heart to move him out of rotation yet." Trish exhaled. "Name's Kyros. Or at least that's what was spray-painted on a crate he was found in. No chip, no collar. But he wasn't always like this." Elena glanced at her. "Used to be K9. Military, then transferred to law enforcement. We only know that much because of an old patch scar on his flank. They don't mark civilian dogs that way." Trish's tone lowered. "Discharged after something went wrong on a call. No one ever claimed him." Kyros hadn't taken his eyes off Mira, and Mira hadn't moved a muscle. "Has he ever approached anyone?" Elena asked. "Not once," Trish replied. "Not even for food. Won't let anyone near his gate. Especially not men. He's still stuck in whatever happened." Elena stood slowly, brushing her hand down Mira's coat sleeve. But Mira didn't move to leave. "I think he remembers what it means to serve," she said, her voice steady. "He just doesn't remember who he's allowed to trust." Elena turned back toward the dog. And in that moment, Kyros did something she hadn't expected. He lowered his head, not in submission, not in exhaustion, but in something that almost looked like permission, as if to say, "I won't bite, not this time, not yet." Elena didn't say anything more. She just reached into her coat, took out a pen, and tucked it behind her ear, a habit she hadn't done since her days working directly with trauma survivors. Mira glanced up at her, smiling just faintly. A secret passed in silence. They weren't there to adopt a dog. But maybe, just maybe, the dog had chosen to see them. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, a soft white noise barely masking the sound of Kyros's breathing. He hadn't moved from his corner. And yet, something in the air had changed. As if the quiet had taken on a different weight, not just absence of sound, but presence, watchful, heavy, fragile. Elena stood still, one hand resting gently on her daughter's back, the other brushing a stray curl behind Mira's ear. She could feel it under her palm. Mira's breath was steady, calm, unafraid. She hadn't looked away from Kyros once. Trish shifted her weight beside them, clipboard forgotten against her chest. Her voice, when it came, was low, the kind you use at hospital bedsides or graves. "No one really knows what happened," she began, eyes fixed on the dog. "He came in from a call-out 3 years ago, a domestic situation that escalated. Something went wrong during entry. His handler was injured badly. Kyros was blamed, labeled unreliable under stress, discharged." She paused, letting the words sit in the air like dust. No one asked what happened to him, just what he did. Kyros's eyes flicked to Trish, then back to Mira. "The report said he broke formation. But dogs don't just break, not trained ones, not unless something inside them already cracked first." Elena nodded slowly. She could see it now, clear as an X-ray. This wasn't rage. It was memory. Mira crouched, not too close, just outside the faded yellow tape line staff had painted around the kennel floor as an invisible boundary. She held her sketch pad like a shield, but her voice came through soft and sure. "I don't think he hates us." Trish glanced down, surprised. Mira didn't look away. "I think he just doesn't believe we're real yet." Elena's breath caught. There it was, said in a single line, with the clarity only children or the broken seem to carry. "He doesn't know if we'll stay, or if we'll shout, or hurt." Elena knelt beside her daughter. "Why do you think that?" Mira shrugged lightly. "Because he's not blinking like the other dogs. They're waiting for treats. He's waiting to be left." Kyros didn't flinch at the sound of their voices, but his body remained a wire stretched tight, not in aggression, but bracing, as if at any moment the world might collapse again, and he needed to be ready. Trish sighed, arms crossing tightly over her chest. "He's never bitten anyone, but he's come close, especially with men. Food aggression, flinch responses, high reactivity to doors slamming." She lowered her voice further. "He won't even sleep with both eyes closed." Elena looked down at the dog, studying him, the tension in his limbs, the stillness that wasn't peace, but control. "Has anyone tried working with him long-term?" she asked. "2 different behaviorists, short bursts, no contact, nothing stuck." Trish's voice grew thinner. "Honestly, he's past the window. Whatever trust he had, it was buried too deep." Elena didn't reply. She was remembering a boy, 6 years old, curled beneath a hospital bed after witnessing his father's overdose. Wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, bit his nurse on day 3. Everyone called him unresponsive. But Elena had sat with him, not coaxing, just present, day after day. On day 12, he blinked in her direction. On day 14, he handed her a crayon. And on day 27, he whispered, "You didn't leave." Mira stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "I want to draw him," she said, voice gentle. Trish blinked. "Draw him?" Mira nodded. "So he can see what he looks like through someone else's eyes." She turned away before anyone could stop her and moved to the empty bench at the end of the corridor, crossed legs, opened her pad, began sketching with quiet confidence. Trish looked to Elina, half bewildered. "She's different." Elina smiled faintly, brushing hair from her own face. "She sees things most people step over." Her eyes returned to Kyros, and again something inside her stirred, deep and familiar. This wasn't a dog who snapped. This was a soldier who had never been allowed to rest, and whose silence had been mistaken for danger rather than grief. "He's not angry," Elina said, repeating Mira's words but now owning them. "He's hurt, and no one stayed long enough to hear what that pain sounds like." Trish hesitated. "You're not thinking of—" "No," Elena interrupted softly. "Not today." Trish exhaled. "But maybe," Elena continued, her voice even, "we could come back." The manager tilted her head. "You sure you want to go down that road?" "No," Elena admitted. "But I think he deserves someone who's willing to walk it with him." Kyros hadn't moved, but his eyes, they no longer looked like stone. Now they looked like someone waiting to see if the world would break its promise one more time. The next morning came with overcast skies and a stillness that felt almost scripted. There was no announcement, no plan, just a shared glance over breakfast, Mira poking at her eggs, Elina nursing a second cup of coffee, and then an unspoken decision. They would go back, not to fix anything, not to ask anything, just to return. The drive was quiet, not awkward, just peaceful. Mira drew silently in the back seat while Elina glanced at her in the rearview mirror now and then, watching how the girl's brow creased when she concentrated. She was sketching again. Elena didn't ask what. At the shelter, the volunteer at the front desk blinked in mild surprise when he saw them walk in. "You were just here yesterday," he said, flipping a clipboard around to hide a Sudoku puzzle. "Did something happen?" "No," Elena replied. "That's why we came back." She didn't elaborate. Down the corridor, the sound of barking was nearly identical to the day before. Dogs springing up at the sight of movement, tails banging against steel, claws scrabbling for attention. The air smelled of bleach and peanut butter. But at the far end, in the kennel where the light barely reached, everything was still. Kyros remained curled in his corner, silent as stone. Trish noticed them from her office doorway. She tilted her head, eyebrows raising slightly. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," she said as she approached, lowering her voice out of habit. "Thought maybe that was a one-time visit." Elina gave a soft shrug. "It doesn't feel finished." Trish looked past her toward the girl. Mira had stopped just short of the kennel gate. Not too close, not too far. She unzipped her coat pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper, no bigger than a postcard. She crouched slowly, knees on the cold floor, and slid it just under the edge of the bars with delicate care. Then she sat. No words, no gestures, just presence. Kyros didn't move. He didn't growl, didn't shift his weight, didn't bare his teeth. He simply watched. The drawing, barely visible from Elina's angle, looked like a child's version of a forest clearing. In the center, a black and tan German shepherd lying beneath a tree, body relaxed, eyes half closed. Around him, grass, light, and stillness. Above, in blocky pencil lines, Mira had written just one sentence. "It's okay to rest." Trish inhaled, held it, then exhaled as if releasing something she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "He doesn't usually tolerate people sitting near him that long," she murmured. "We're not doing anything," Elina replied. "That's the point." Minutes passed. Mira never looked away. She didn't try to speak to Kyros, didn't call his name. She simply was there. Her sketchpad rested in her lap, untouched for once. Her eyes were quiet, unwavering. Kyros's chest rose and fell, steady. Not calm, but not bracing anymore either. The way he used to press himself deeper into the corner, to become invisible, to protect what was left of him, he didn't do that today. And that was something. Elina leaned against the wall and let the hum of the shelter fade into the background. For a moment, she forgot about work emails, therapy notes, the mountain of dishes in the sink at home. All she saw was this dog coiled silent, waiting, and her daughter, whose presence seemed to whisper the one thing trauma never expects to hear. "I'm not here to take anything from you." Trish crossed her arms, her voice low. "I've been doing this for 20 years, you know. I've seen dogs bark their way into families. I've seen pit bulls dance for attention. I've seen seniors get adopted just because they wagged once." She paused. "But I've never seen a dog say nothing and have a kid sit anyway." Elina didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. Not yet. After 30 minutes, Mira stood. No rush, no noise. She left the drawing behind, just under the gate, a quiet offering. Then she looked up at Kyros and nodded once. No smile, just acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked back to her mother. Kyros never took his eyes off her. As they left the hallway, Trish followed them with her gaze. "You coming back tomorrow?" "I don't know," Elina said. But her eyes drifted toward the cage behind her, toward the shadow of a dog who hadn't snarled today, and she knew that somehow tomorrow was already decided. Because healing didn't always begin with touch. Sometimes it began with sitting in silence beside something that forgot it could be seen. The house was quiet after Mira went to bed, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old song, barely rustling the dry leaves still clinging to the maples. The floor creaked once beneath Elina's feet as she carried a steaming mug of tea to the living room, then sank into her armchair with the careful heaviness of someone who had spent the day observing too much. She didn't turn on the TV, didn't check her phone. Instead, she pulled out a thin manila folder, creased, slightly stained, the top corner curled, and laid it on the coffee table. Kyros. That was all it said in black marker. No last name, no nickname, just the label of something left behind. Elina had requested the file that afternoon. Trish didn't hesitate. "You're the first one who's asked," she'd said. Her tone had been somewhere between hope and surrender. Elina opened the folder now, slow and methodical, like unwrapping something fragile. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, a few printed photos, and one small handwritten note folded in half and taped to the back of the last report. She started with the top page. Canine profile. Assigned name, Kyros breed, German Shepherd. Age, estimated 6 to 7 years. Original unit. Tactical Canine Division, contracted military ops. Transferred to City of High Tree Canine Unit, law enforcement specialization, tracking, controlled aggression, Tactical entry support. Discharge. Status. Involuntary separation. Elena skimmed the next lines. Her eyes stopped on a sentence halfway down the page. Handler injured during a high-stress breach. Kyros deviated from assigned formation, broke focus. Post-event behavior included extreme resistance to commands, withdrawal, defensive posture. Labeled high risk. Recommendation: retirement from service or transfer to long-term care. No further context, no follow-up, just the language of bureaucracy. Clinical, detached. She turned to the second sheet. Behavioral assessment. Phase 2, shelter intake. Evaluator: Dr. Morgan Klein. Date: 9 months ago. Observations: avoidant behavior in 100% of interactions. Refuses to engage with handlers. Growls or lunges when approached, especially by male staff. Does not respond to verbal recall. No interest in food during presence of humans. Sleeps only in corners facing entrance. Startle reflex high. Conclusion: unreachable, unadoptable. Aggression likely reinforced by prior training and mishandled trauma. Elena leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting upward toward the ceiling as if trying to make room for the weight those words carried. She had seen language like this before, written about veterans, children in care, survivors of domestic violence, words that pretended to describe but instead dismissed. Unreachable, as if healing were about compliance, as if silence meant there was nothing worth hearing. She took a long sip of tea, then reached for the photographs tucked into the file. The first was a blurry shot of Kyros at the shelter pressed into the back corner of his kennel, eyes reflecting the camera flash like two shards of amber glass. His body coiled, tail tucked, mouth slightly parted. But it was the second photo that stopped her. A grainy black-and-white image, likely from his service days. Kyros mid-stride, leaping over a barrier, teeth bared, not in rage, but in perfect focus. Beside him, a man in full tactical gear, one arm raised in command. Elena stared at that photo for a long time. There was a discipline in Kyros's movement. Not violence, precision, obedience, trust. Someone had once believed in this dog enough to bring him into rooms full of chaos and ask him to stay calm. Someone had once trained him not to attack, but to wait, to read body language, to make decisions faster than a man with a weapon. And then something went wrong, and the dog paid for it. She turned over the last sheet, just a single note, in rough handwriting. Won't let anyone in, doesn't respond, doesn't even try. Feels like sitting next to a ghost. Elena set the folder aside. She pressed the heel of her palm against her forehead and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. What she saw today wasn't a ghost. It was a presence that had never been given permission to lower its guard. It was a mind locked in patterns it had been taught for survival, and a heart that had never been told, "You don't have to serve anymore to be worthy of staying." Her therapist mind began to form theory's classic signs of combat-related trauma: hypervigilance, detachment, defensive posturing. But beneath those terms was something simpler, something more human: loss, not of a job or a handler, but of purpose, of place, of belief that safety still existed. From the hallway, a floorboard creaked. Mira's soft footsteps padded across the wooden floor until she appeared in the doorway, oversized pajama sleeves hanging past her hands. "You're still up," she said, rubbing one eye. "Couldn't sleep." Elina murmured, motioning for her to come closer. Mira sat beside her mother on the couch and glanced at the file. She didn't ask what was in it. Instead, she whispered, "You're thinking about him?" Elina looked at her daughter, at the calm in her voice, the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need proof to believe what she felt. "I think he remembers everything," Mira added, almost to herself. "Even the parts that hurt." Elina nodded. "I think you're right." Mira laid her head on her mother's shoulder. "He watched me today, Mom," she said softly, "like he wanted to believe I was real." Elena's voice was barely audible. "Maybe you were the first one who didn't ask him to prove it." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind outside. And Elina knew, in the deepest part of her chest, that the work had already begun. Not with training, not with commands, but with being seen. It was their third visit. No schedule, no pressure. Just another quiet morning where mother and daughter had chosen presence over productivity. The shelter hall hummed with the same background noise, hopeful barks, the shuffle of sneakers on linoleum, the occasional clang of a gate being latched. But as they reached the end of the row, the familiar silence returned, the kind that belonged only to Kyros. He was there, exactly where he always was. Tucked into the back corner of his kennel, one paw curled beneath his chest, ears alert but not raised. He saw them immediately, saw her. Mira didn't speak. She didn't need to. She sat down slowly, careful not to break the invisible perimeter around him. Her sketchpad rested on her knees, a fresh page already waiting. Today, she began to hum, soft, wordless. Just a melody she made up on the spot, rising and falling like breath, fragile and warm. Elina couldn't place the tune. Maybe it wasn't a tune at all. Maybe it was just her daughter's way of being present in sound. Kyros lifted his head. His eyes didn't narrow. His body didn't tense. His lips didn't curl. He didn't growl. Elina's hand froze halfway through her coat zipper. Mira kept humming, completely unaware that something extraordinary was happening. Kyros stared. But this time, it wasn't with suspicion. It was something more primitive, almost childlike. Like he was watching a language he hadn't heard in years and didn't know he remembered. A sound not meant to command him, not to test him, just include him. For 7 full minutes, no one moved. And then Mira smiled, not because he came closer or wagged his tail. He didn't. She smiled because he didn't leave. That was enough. Trish, standing farther down the hall with a mop in hand, paused mid-swipe and leaned against the wall. Her voice was low, but awestruck. "That's a first." Elina nodded silently. Later, back at home, Mira was quiet. Not her usual observant quiet. This was different, focused, meditative. She sat on the rug in front of the fireplace, crayons and pencils spread across the floor like a sunburst. A single sheet of paper anchored it all, her fingers working with patient, careful strokes. Elina watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed loosely. She didn't interrupt. Not until Mira held up the drawing and whispered, "Look." It was Kyros, unmistakably. The same sloped shoulders, the folded ears. But this time, he wasn't behind bars or crouched in a corner. He was lying beneath a tree, on a patch of sun-dappled grass. No muzzle, no chain. His eyes were closed, not as if sleeping from exhaustion, but resting, trusting, safe. There were no fences in the background, no shadows, just stillness. Elena knelt beside her and brushed a hand through Mira's curls. "He's not guarding the tree?" Mira shook her head. "No, he's just part of it." They sat there for a while, the fire crackling gently nearby, soft orange light dancing across the paper. And in that space between image and reality, Elena felt something shift within herself. Until now, she had been viewing Kyros through a clinical lens. She wasn't ashamed of that. It was the instinct of someone who'd spent her life helping others navigate damage. She knew the signs of trauma, the arc of reactivity, the checklist of what made someone high risk. But this wasn't that. This wasn't about control or danger or even recovery. This was about waiting. What if Kyros wasn't broken at all? What if he was simply someone who had been treated like a machine for too long, only now beginning to remember he was alive? She looked at her daughter, this tiny, bright soul who didn't read files or analyze symptoms. Mira didn't diagnose. She witnessed. And somehow, in doing so, she'd made Kyros take the first step back toward being seen. "He didn't growl today," Elena said softly. Mira smiled, chin on her knees. "Because I didn't ask him for anything." Elena felt her throat tighten. There was a kind of genius in that simplicity. That night, after Mira had gone to bed, Elena stood by the front window and looked out at the moonlit yard. Her tea had long since gone cold in her hands, but she hadn't noticed. In her mind, she saw the eyes of a dog who hadn't flinched when the girl hummed. A dog who hadn't bared his teeth, not because he trusted, but because maybe, just maybe, he was starting to wonder if trust was still something he was allowed to feel. She whispered to the darkness beyond the glass, "You don't have to be fixed. You just have to be heard." The form wasn't long, just 2 pages, a checklist, a few open-ended questions, room for an optional essay, though no one ever filled that part out. They usually didn't need to. Except this time, Elena did. She sat in the passenger seat of her car in the shelter parking lot, pen poised over the last box. "What makes you believe you're the right home for this animal?" She didn't write right away. Inside the shelter, Mira was petting a Labrador through the gate, her laughter floating faintly through the open windows. But Elena wasn't listening to the sound. She was remembering a pair of amber eyes that hadn't growled when her daughter hummed, a dog that hadn't trusted anyone in months, but hadn't looked away. She started writing. The board met on Wednesdays. Not formally, a circle of folding chairs in the back room of the shelter, where the smell of bleach never quite left the floor. 6 people, most with decades in animal welfare, some practical, some kind, some tired. They weren't used to surprises. When Trish walked in with Elena's application, they passed it around like it was warm to the touch. "Kyros?" one of them said, adjusting her glasses. "That can't be right." "It's real," Trish replied. "She wants to adopt him." There was a long pause, like the silence that comes right before a dropped glass hits the floor. "She has a kid," someone said. "A 10-year-old, added Dr. Morgan, the shelter's consulting veterinarian, eyes narrowing over his half-finished coffee. "You can't be serious." "I am," Elena said from the doorway. They turned. She hadn't been announced. She didn't wait to be invited in. "I'm not just a mother," she continued. "I'm a trauma specialist. I work with PTSD patients, combat veterans, children in foster care. I know what Kyros is carrying, and I know what it takes to walk with him through it." Dr. Morgan crossed his arms. And you think a house with a child is the right place to do that? Elena didn't flinch. Yes, because she's not afraid of him. And more importantly, he's not afraid of her. But you've only seen him a few times, another board member said, glancing down at the application. You're making a judgment based on a few moments of— I'm not judging, Elena interrupted, her voice even. I'm listening, which is more than most people have done for that dog. A woman with gray hair and tired eyes leaned forward. I read your essay, the part where you said he doesn't need rehabilitation. He needs someone to stop trying to fix him. That's a compelling line. But he's still a risk. They all are, Elena replied. Every animal that comes through those gates is a risk. So are the people. Dr. Morgan leaned forward. He almost bit a handler last month. And that same handler slammed a crate door behind him, Trish added quietly. Eyes turned. Dr. Morgan's jaw tightened. So we reward that behavior? We don't punish fear, Elena said. We understand it. There was silence. Then a voice from the end of the table, quiet, almost unsure. She's the one with the little girl, right? The woman asked. The girl who left drawings at the gate? Trish nodded. Every day? I saw one, the woman murmured. It said, it's okay to rest. Elena's voice softened, but didn't shake. My daughter doesn't see what's broken. She sees what's waiting. A long silence followed. Papers shuffled, feet tapped. Someone cleared their throat. Dr. Morgan finally spoke again. If he snaps, if there's a single incident, you can take him back, Elena said. The words dropped like stone. I'll sign a release. I'll send weekly progress updates. I'll work with your behaviorist. But I won't back down from this. The board whispered among themselves. Trish stayed silent, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she raised her voice. I've seen Kyros react to dozens of people, she said. Staff, volunteers. He either growls or shuts down. But when Mira sat near him, he didn't growl. He didn't flinch. She turned to Elena. She didn't even speak to him. She didn't need to, Elena replied. A vote was called. 4 in favor, 3 opposed. It passed, but barely. A conditional approval. Immediate return if aggression escalates. Regular home checks. Session reports with a professional. No unsupervised time with the child until further notice. Elena accepted all of it. As she walked out into the fading light, Trish caught up to her at the door. You're really doing this, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I already am, Elena answered. Through the window she saw Mira waiting by the car, a folded sketch pad in her hands. She looked up and smiled, not a broad grin, not a celebration, just quiet, knowing hope. The kind of smile that said, I knew you'd see what I saw. The room was too quiet for a room full of people. No one was leaning back in their chair. No one checked their phone. The clink of Dr. Morgan stirring his coffee was the only sound for a long stretch, and even that felt like a misstep. A folded printout of Elena's application sat at the center of the table, the top corner curled upward from where someone had fidgeted with it. Her handwritten essay still clipped beneath it. The words, he doesn't need to be fixed, he needs to feel safe enough to unfold, were underlined in pencil. Trish stood just behind Elena now, arms crossed, not in defiance, but defense. She said she's willing to do behavioral updates every week. She's not naive, Trish told them, and she's the first person he hasn't reacted to in over 9 months. Dr. Morgan didn't look up. That means nothing if it's a fluke. We've all seen dogs fake calm until they snap. But Kyros isn't faking, Trish replied. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch when Mira sat near him. I was there. I saw it. That girl is 10 years old, another board member said sharply, a woman in a red cardigan with worry knitted into her forehead. If he so much as bares his teeth at her, then he comes back, Elena said quietly. All eyes turned to her. Her voice was level, not rehearsed, just sure. I understand the risks, but so does my daughter. She's not walking into this blind. Dr. Morgan pushed back in his seat. You say you understand trauma, but do you understand this kind of trauma? This isn't a man talking about his war memories. This is a 75-pound animal with teeth who doesn't forget how to lunge. Elena didn't flinch. And yet, he didn't. That silenced him. She let that hang in the air. For 3 days, Mira has sat outside his gate. No contact, no food in hand, no command, just presence. And for 3 days, he has done something he hasn't done since the day you locked that gate. She looked each person in the eye. He stayed. The woman in the red cardigan shifted. Why now? Why this dog? Elena's voice dipped lower. Because I see what happens when you treat fear like a crime, when you mistake protection for aggression. He's not dangerous by nature. He's damaged by experience. The room breathed, and then Trish spoke again, stepping forward for the first time. I've worked with every dog that's come through those doors for 12 years, she said. Some bounced back in days, some never did, but I have never, not once, seen Kyros allow a child to sit near him without growling. Until Mira. She looked at the board with something close to plea but not desperation, just belief. That means something. Silence again. The vote was called. 6 members present. 1 absentee who had emailed in a preemptive abstention. The rest were handed index cards, a simple system. Check green for approval, red for deny. Elena didn't breathe as they wrote, didn't blink as the cards were turned over one by one. Green, red, red, green, green. And then the last card flipped. Green. Trish let out a breath so soft only Elena heard it. The chair of the board nodded grimly. Motion passes. 4-3. But the next words came clipped, cautious. Approval is contingent. You'll submit weekly reports to our behaviorist, Dr. Heller. Any incident, any sign of regression, Kyros comes back. No questions asked. I accept, Elena said, before the sentence had fully left his mouth. And no unsupervised time with the child for the first 60 days. I understand. Dr. Morgan didn't smile. He simply slid the papers toward Trish. Make it official. Elena stood quietly, her palms pressed together to stop them from shaking. It wasn't relief. Not yet. Just weight shifting. As she turned to leave, the woman in the cardigan called after her, not unkindly. Why are you so sure he won't snap? Elena paused at the doorway. I'm not. She turned halfway, meeting the woman's eyes. But I know what it looks like when someone doesn't want to be saved, and what it looks like when they're too tired to hope someone will try. A beat passed. And Kyros hasn't stopped watching us since we met. That's not aggression. That's someone trying to decide if we're worth the risk. Outside, the air felt colder than before, though the sun had finally pushed past the clouds. Mira sat on the low stone wall near the parking lot, sketchpad in her lap, drawing something new. Elena walked over, crouched beside her. "Well?" Mira asked without looking up. "It passed." Mira smiled. Not a grin, not a cheer, just a quiet, deep kind of smile. The kind that said, "I knew they'd see what I saw. Eventually." The back lot of the shelter was quiet, the kind of stillness that settles after the last volunteer leaves and before the night wind finds its way through the kennels. A few distant barks echoed from inside, but out here it was only gravel, rusted fencing, and the low hum of possibility. Kyros stood at the edge of his gate, muscles locked, eyes tracking every movement like they were being measured against danger. The crate sat in front of him, open, clean, lined with soft bedding, the kind volunteers had prepped for weeks in case a miracle ever happened. But Kyros didn't move. Elena didn't ask him to. She crouched 10 feet away, saying nothing, her hands open and resting on her thighs. Mira sat beside her on the curb, her sketchpad pressed to her chest, silent and still. The SUV's back hatch stood open. Inside, a barrier of cushions and fencing had been carefully built, not a cage, just space, a place Kyros could choose to enter or not. "He's not going to like the sound of the door," Trish said quietly, arms crossed. "We've had to replace it twice already." "Then we won't close it," Elena replied. Mira looked up. "He can ride with it open? We'll secure the interior, strap the outer gate, just enough to keep him from feeling trapped." Trish hesitated, then gave a small nod. "This is the strangest adoption I've ever signed off on." Elena smiled faintly. "Good." It had been 31 minutes since the crate door opened. Kyros had taken 3 steps forward, then 2 back, then 1 to the side. Not once had anyone raised a voice. No tugging leads, no treat bribes, just breath, patience, space. He stood now 3 feet from the ramp, paws planted on concrete, tail low but not tucked. His eyes flicked between Elena and Mira. And then, slowly, silently, he exhaled and stepped in. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't leap or pause for applause. He just moved, like he'd always known the way but had needed the quiet to remember it. Once inside, he circled once, then twice, and lay down, not curled tight, but long, stretched, his ribs rising slow and steady. Mira didn't cheer. She just stood up, walked to the side window, and pressed her palm softly to the glass. Kyros turned his head. Their eyes met through the pain girl and dog, child and soldier. No growl, no bark, just breath. Elena fastened the back, gently closed the hatch without a slam, and slid into the driver's seat. Trish stood nearby, clipboard forgotten at her side. "You really think he'll make it?" Elena didn't look back. "I think he already has." The engine turned. The tires crunched gravel. Mira sat beside her mother, watching Kyros through the rearview mirror, her hand still on her lap, fingers resting over the spot where the glass had been. As the shelter grew smaller in the rear window, Kyros didn't whimper, didn't pace. He just watched, like something inside him was finally beginning to shift, not because he was being taken away, but because he was being brought home. The SUV pulled into the gravel drive just before dusk. The old farmhouse stood quietly at the end of the lane, bathed in the last gold streaks of late afternoon sun. A single porch light flickered on as the motion sensor caught them. Wind moved softly through the trees, rustling leaves like whispered instructions. No one said anything as Elena turned off the engine. Mira unbuckled slowly, glancing toward the back. She didn't ask if she could open the hatch. She knew better. In the rear compartment, Kyros hadn't moved. He lay exactly where he had settled, limbs tucked close, eyes half open, body rigid, not with fear, but uncertainty. The kind of tension that came from not knowing if the place ahead was another station or the end of the line. Alina stepped out first. No slam of the door, no clipped commands, just presence. She circled to the back and gently opened the hatch. The barrier they'd built for the ride had held, not containment consent. He hadn't tried to escape. He hadn't barked once, but he didn't move. The farmhouse door stood open. Inside, a soft amber glow lit the hallway. The entryway had been cleared of noise, clutter, and anything that might startle a space not built for obedience, but invitation. Alina placed a soft lead on the ground beside the vehicle, not to loop around his neck, not to tug. Just there. A choice. Then she stepped back and waited. Mira sat on the porch steps, hands resting on her knees, legs swinging slowly above the grass. She didn't call out, didn't coax. She simply watched, as though watching was enough. Minutes passed. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and dry leaves. Kyros lifted his head. One ear flicked, then the other. He scanned the open yard, the tree line, the porch, the door. Still, he didn't move. Alina didn't speak. Her knees ached from standing so still, but she stayed rooted, because she knew this was not a moment to hurry. This was sacred ground. 15 minutes passed, then 20. A crow called from the telephone line. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine groaned on the highway. And then he moved. First, just a paw shifting slightly. Then another. Kyros pushed himself upright, slow and deliberate, his back legs stiff from stillness. He sniffed the air, stepped forward. One foot touched gravel. Then another. The lead remained on the ground. He didn't look at Alina, didn't glance at Mira. He simply walked past the SUV, past the grass, toward the open door. When he reached the threshold, he paused, not in fear, in calculation. The light inside glowed warmly. A single rug lay by the hallway entrance. A bowl of water off to the side. A crate door, open, not closed, sat tucked against the wall, filled with soft bedding and flanked by nothing sharp, nothing loud. He stood there for 6 full seconds, then stepped inside. The moment was so quiet, it felt like a held breath. Mira turned to her mother, voice barely more than air. "Is this his forever spot?" Alina looked into the house, watched as Kyros sniffed a corner, then backed away. His tail remained low, but not tucked. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He just explored. She bent slightly and whispered back, "Only if he wants it to be." Mira didn't smile, but her hand moved to her chest, lightly pressing over her heart. A gesture of thanks, or maybe just relief. Inside, Kyros circled once near the crate, then backed into it, eyes facing the door, body still alert but not panicked. He rested his chin on the edge, ears forward, listening. He had entered, but not surrendered, and that was enough. Alina stepped into the house, taking off her shoes without a sound. She lowered herself into the chair near the window, not between Kyros and the door, never between him and the way out. Mira followed, curling up on the hallway bench, sketchpad in hand. She didn't draw. Not yet. She just sat. 37 minutes after they arrived, Alina finally closed the front door. No click, just a whisper of wood meeting frame. Kyros didn't flinch. And that, more than any wagging tail or excited bark, was the loudest sound in the house. The house learned to move around Kyros, not the other way around. It started the morning after he arrived, when Elena set a ceramic bowl of food down just outside the open crate. She stepped back, then farther, and finally into the next room where she waited, not watching, not hovering, just listening. Nothing, not even the soft click of nails on wood. The food sat untouched for hours. Only after the house had gone completely still, after Mira had gone to bed, and Elena had turned out the last lamp, did Kyros edge forward. One bite, then two, then all of it, in near silence. The next day they tried again, same distance, same bowl, same outcome. He would not eat in front of them. Not yet. Elena understood this. In trauma recovery, some patients couldn't make eye contact for months. Some flinched when asked their name. Some needed silence just to remember what hunger felt like. Mira didn't complain. She adapted. Instead of asking what he needed, she started giving him what she could in a language that asked for nothing in return. She began to draw. Each morning, before school, she placed a new sketch next to his bowl. Never flashy, never loud, just small squares of soft color on thick paper. A rising sun, a simple red heart, a paw print surrounded by soft green grass. She never explained them. She never stayed to watch. But she always returned in the evening to collect the empty bowl. The pictures remained, and over time they started to curl slightly at the edges from his breath, his steps, the brush of his tail. A week passed, then another. He still refused food in their presence. But one morning, Elena noticed something. When she placed the bowl down, Kyros didn't retreat to the back of the crate. He stayed where he was, 10 feet away, head low, watching. Not challenging, just choosing. His eyes followed her, not with fear, but assessment. That afternoon, Elena sat down with Mira on the living room rug, a notebook in her lap. "We're going to learn his language," she said. Mira perked up. "You mean barking?" "No," Elena smiled. "The words he can't say." They began to take notes. Every flick of an ear, every shift of weight, every tail movement. A quick flick meant tension. A low wag, curiosity. Ears forward, eyes steady calculation. Ears back, body still. Overwhelm. "He's talking all the time," Mira whispered one night as they watched him from the hallway. "Just not in a way people expect." That became their rhythm. A home that didn't demand entry, but invited presence. Mealtimes became rituals of silence. Elena would set the food down at exactly the same time each day, using the same bowl, the same distance. Mira would add her drawing folded now, like a letter instead of a display, as if to say, "You don't have to look, but if you want to, I'm here." By week 3, Kyros began to eat with the hallway light on. By week 4, he finished before the bowl was cold. The first time it happened while Mira was still in the room, she didn't say anything. She just smiled into her lap and kept coloring. Progress wasn't measured in miles. It came in inches, in breaths, in the sound of dry kibble being eaten while a child quietly hummed in the next room. One morning, Elena entered the kitchen and froze. Kyros was standing not near the crate, but at the edge of the table close enough to see her, far enough to retreat. He didn't move. He didn't growl. He just stood. Elena didn't speak. She turned, reached into the cabinet, and pulled down the bowl. Her hand moved slowly, fluid. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. She poured the food and stepped back, not out of fear, but out of respect. Kyros didn't eat right away. But he didn't leave either. And that moment, his stillness in her presence spoke louder than any bark ever could. That night, Mira added a new drawing to the stack. It showed Kyros with his eyes half closed, lying beneath a window, with a single shaft of sunlight falling across his face. No fences, no collar, just a dog at rest. Elena taped it to the fridge, a reminder not of what had been achieved, but of what had been allowed. It started with pacing, not frantic, not aggressive. Just a slow, measured patrol across the living room, one end of the rug to the other, then a sharp turn near the hallway wall, followed by another slow march back. Kyros didn't whine, didn't bark, but something in his posture ears, angled slightly back, head low, eyes flicking toward the window, told Elena something was off. She glanced up from the couch, book still open in her lap. "Kyros?" He didn't look at her, just turned again. Another pass. Elena set the book down, stood slowly, and moved toward the back door, which was closed but unlocked. Maybe he heard something outside. Maybe he was restless. Maybe... She reached for the handle. That's when it happened. Kyros lunged not at her, but forward, fast and low, like a shadow suddenly unpinned from the floor. His shoulder brushed hers. His paw scraped the tile. A deep, unfiltered growl rumbled from his chest. Not rage, not threat, just urgency. Elena froze, her hand hovering an inch from the latch. Kyros didn't bite. He didn't even touch her. He bolted past, toward the door, circled once, and then he squatted, right there, in front of the glass. Elena blinked, and it hit her. He hadn't known how to ask. All this time, through routines and rituals and carefully calculated silence, they had studied his body language like scripture. But they had never given him a way to speak. When Elena opened the door, Kyros stepped outside without hesitation. He didn't run. He didn't bark at the trees or chase wind. He just stood in the moonlight, breathing. And then, after a minute, he turned back toward her, eyes soft, posture calm, and walked inside on his own. No lead, no coaxing, just choice. Later that night, Elena sat at the dining table with Mira, explaining what had happened. The girl listened without interrupting, legs curled beneath her in a worn sweater 3 sizes too big. When Elena finished, Mira didn't ask why it mattered. She simply got up, walked to her school bag, and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. A tiny brass bell, no bigger than a walnut. "I was saving this," she said, "but maybe he needs it more than my backpack does." Elena raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll use it?" Mira's smile was small but certain. "He doesn't need to bark. He just needs a sound that means something." Together they tied the bell to a length of navy blue ribbon and fastened it gently to the doorknob, low enough for a paw, loud enough to be heard. When they stepped back, Mira tilted her head and said softly, "This is how we help him speak." Elena brushed a hand through her daughter's hair, her voice even softer. "And this is how we learn to listen." The next 2 days passed without incident. Kyros studied the bell like it was a trap at first, sniffing, circling, stepping back. He never touched it, but he didn't growl either. It was as if he understood it was for him, but hadn't yet decided whether to claim it. On the 3rd night, while Elena was folding towels in the laundry room and Mira was upstairs doing homework, she heard it, a single chime, soft, accidental maybe, like a coin dropping on tile. She paused, heartbeat stuttering. Then it came again, not loud, but intentional. Elena walked slowly to the door. Kyros stood beside it, body relaxed, ears forward, tail loose and swaying just once. She opened it. He stepped outside. No pacing, no growl. Just a pause beneath the porch light, followed by a few careful steps into the grass. He came back within 2 minutes. And when he did, Elena was waiting with the door still open. That night, Mira taped a new drawing beside the bell. A dog with one paw raised, eyes wide and proud. Below it, she'd written in blocky pencil letters, "Good boys ask." From then on, the bell became more than a sound. It became a sentence, a decision, a bridge. Each time Kyros rang it, it wasn't just to go outside, it was to say, "I'm here, I have a need, and I trust you to hear it." And every time the door opened, it said back, "We do." The storm arrived like a slow breath held too long. It hadn't been on the forecast, just one of those rogue mountain tempests that rolled in without warning, painting the sky in bruises and stirring the trees into frantic whispers. Rain tapped against the windows like fingers seeking entry. Somewhere down the road, a branch cracked under its own weight. Inside, the house was dim but warm. Mira lay on her stomach, coloring on the living room rug, the fire's glow painting soft shadows across her shoulders. Elena stirred soup on the stove, listening to the rhythm of thunder building in the distance. Kyros sat near the hallway, half in shadow, his eyes half-lidded but alert. He had spent the better part of the day drifting through the house, not hiding, not patrolling. Just there, a quiet presence in each room, like a thought that followed without pushing. The bell by the door jingled softly, once accidental. A draft, maybe. Kyros's ears flicked but didn't rise. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps against the front door. Not polite, not hesitant, loud. Kyros's body snapped into motion. No warning, no snarl, just movement clean, fast, decisive. Elena turned at the sound of claws on hardwood, just in time to see him bolt from the hallway, past the edge of the rug, and plant himself between Mira and the front door. He didn't bark, not at first. He stood like a wall, head low, body still, muscles tight beneath his coat. And then the growl, low, deep, vibrating through the floorboards and up into Elena's spine. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Elena's hand moved instinctively toward Mira, guiding her back gently without urgency. The girl obeyed, slipping behind her mother without a word. Through the window, Elena saw a flash of a raincoat and a cap delivery uniform, logo blurred by the downpour. The man raised a package in one hand, the other on the doorknob. He twisted. The handle rattled. Kyros's growl deepened, ears pinned back now, not in fear but resolve. Elena didn't call his name, didn't reach for him. Instead, she stepped sideways, standing parallel, not blocking, not pulling. She faced the door. "We're good," she said aloud, her voice calm but edged with steel. "Just leave the package, please." The man, startled by the tone, or maybe by the unmistakable presence on the other side of the door, froze. His gaze darted to the narrow window beside the frame, where Kyros's outline loomed just beyond the curtain. He set the package down and backed away quickly. Within seconds, the delivery van was reversing down the gravel drive, taillights vanishing into the storm. Still, Kyros didn't move. Rain battered the windows now. Lightning flashed in the trees. He remained in place, broad shoulders blocking the door, ears twitching with every shift of the wind, breath low and fast. Only when the world fell quiet again did he exhale. and lower his head. Elena spoke without reaching. "Thank you," she said softly. "You protected her." Kyros blinked slowly, still watching the door, still waiting. Mira stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, her voice no louder than the rain. "He didn't just get scared," she whispered. "He stood his ground." Elena met her daughter's eyes. "And that's what trust looks like," she said gently. "Not perfect, not calm, just real." Kyros finally stepped back, only a few inches, as if releasing something only he had been holding. Then, wordless, he lay down on the doormat. Not in fear, in guard, in choice. And for the first time in his life, maybe ever, it wasn't because he was told to. It was because he wanted to stay. The door was still shut. Rain continued to drum on the porch roof like a soft war drum, steady and relentless. The lights flickered once but held. And in the glow of the entryway, Kyros remained motionless. No one told him to stay, but he did. Lying there, shoulders squared, his thick frame curled slightly but coiled, not in fear, not in tension, but in readiness. Like a soldier refusing to stand down until the last ripple of threat was gone. Elena stood a few feet back, hand still loosely resting on Mira's shoulder. Her own heart was slowing, catching up with what had just passed. A moment earlier, everything could have unraveled. A lunge, a bite, a report, a consequence. But it hadn't, because Kyros had chosen something else. "Leave the package," she had said, voice steady like a lullaby for tension, and the man, perhaps sensing more than just the weight behind her words, had obeyed. No further questions, no confrontation, just retreat. Now only the storm remained, and the stillness inside. Elena walked to the door, not toward Kyros, but near enough for him to notice, and slowly slid the package in with her foot. No sudden movements, no shifting of tone. Kyros flicked an ear but didn't move. He didn't snarl, he didn't retreat to his crate. He stayed. By the door. By them. Mira knelt beside her mother and whispered just above the crackle of the fireplace behind them. He didn't bark to scare him off. Elena glanced down. "No," she murmured, voice full of something neither pride nor awe, but something quieter, more sacred. He stood his ground. Mira looked at Kyros for a long moment, then whispered the kind of thing only a child could say without sounding foolish. "He knew what mattered." Elena exhaled through her nose. That was it. That was the difference. He hadn't reacted like a wild animal or a broken one. He hadn't bitten or lunged blindly. He'd placed himself between them and the door with intention. And not out of habit, but out of something far older than training. Instinct. Belonging. A flicker of love, rough-edged, wordless, and uncertain. Elena crouched slowly, her knees aching slightly, and sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor a few feet away from him. No words, no commands. She just sat. Mira followed suit, crisscross on the rug. The three of them made a strange triangle in the room, no one touching, no one demanding, but all present. And Kyros didn't shift, didn't glance, didn't need to. His breathing was audible, steady. In, out, in, out. Through the years, Elena had worked with dozens of trauma survivors' children, soldiers, victims of unspeakable things, and she knew this posture. The moment a body doesn't return to safety after a threat, but instead stays, not to guard, but to connect. She watched his chest rise and fall, and whispered, half to herself, "That's what trust looks like." Mira turned to her. "Like guarding?" Elena shook her head gently. "Like choosing not to leave." They sat like that for what might have been 10 minutes or 40. It didn't matter. The wind howled again outside. The storm had found its full voice now, and the trees along the field swayed like dancers in mourning. But in here, there was no fear. Kyros let his eyes close halfway. He wasn't asleep, not yet. But something in him had rested, not surrendered, not submitted, but rested. Mira shifted slightly and lay back on the rug, her fingers folding the edge of her sketchbook. "Do you think he ever had this before?" she asked softly. "A family?" Elena didn't answer right away. She studied Kyros again. His ear twitch, the faint scar above one eye, the tense but quiet rhythm of his breathing. "I think," she said slowly, "he had orders, and people who gave them. But not warmth?" "No," Elena said, eyes not leaving him. "Not warmth, not freedom, and not choice." Mira's voice dropped to a hush, like a prayer she didn't want him to hear but hoped he would feel. "Then I'm glad he found us." Kyros shifted, not much, just enough to face the door more squarely again, as if anchoring himself. Mira smiled. "Still new?" she said, quoting her mother's words from earlier that week. "Still fragile?" Elena reached out, not toward Kyros, but toward her daughter, and smoothed a curl away from Mira's forehead. But real. They stayed like that as the storm rolled on. One woman, one girl, and one dog who had once forgotten how to stay, and now refused to leave. The fire had quieted to embers. Soft orange light flickered low across the floor, casting gentle shadows along the worn planks and the scattered sketches Mira had left behind, crayons still uncapped, a half-finished drawing of a tree with a shape curled beneath it. Outside, the storm had rolled on like a tired sigh. Wind now only whispered across the windows, like a child tapping for reassurance. The farmhouse had exhaled with it. Inside, stillness held. Mira had fallen asleep hours ago. She was curled near the fireplace, wrapped in the same wool blanket she insisted on using every night, a faded green square with a stitched moon in the corner. Her sketchbook was still beneath her hand, though her fingers had gone slack. And beside her, not touching but closer than ever, was Kyros. Not in the doorway, not by the kitchen tile, not at a calculated distance, but near. His paws stretched forward, body slightly curved in Mira's direction, eyes half-lidded but awake, not asleep, not guarding, just there. His breathing was deep and measured, the kind that came not from exhaustion but from deliberate choice. A rhythm formed over trust, not training. Elena stood in the hallway watching them. She hadn't planned to come downstairs. A creaking pipe had stirred her. Or maybe it was habit, the kind mothers develop when their child sleeps too quietly. Whatever it was, it had pulled her from bed at 3:07 a.m., and now she was frozen. Not in fear, but reverence, because this was the moment she hadn't known she was waiting for. She didn't dare speak at first, not even a breath too loud. Kyros's ears flicked once in her direction, and his eyes opened slightly, catching her silhouette in the dark. But he didn't move, didn't shift away, didn't harden. He just saw her and stayed. That alone, the staying, was a miracle in motion. Elena slowly stepped into the glow of the firelight, letting her bare feet pad softly over the floor. Kyros didn't react. His gaze held her for a beat, then returned to the child sleeping beside him. A flicker of something passed across his expression, not human, not readable, but something ancient, animal, loyal, whole. She crouched down a few feet away, letting her knees fold beneath her. Mira's hair had tumbled into her face, her breathing even, small lips parted just slightly, innocence wrapped in exhaustion. And Kyros? He had inched closer again, not enough to touch, but enough to feel. Elena's eyes prickled, not because of the hour, not from fatigue, but from the weight of it all. This dog-branded, aggressive, unreachable, unadoptable, was choosing presence over protection, silence over withdrawal, nearness over escape. And somehow he'd chosen it not for safety, but for her child. Elena swallowed hard. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible, just a whisper, the kind only a dog might hear and understand. "Good night, brave boy." Kyros didn't stir, didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once soft against the rug, like a heartbeat you almost miss. Elena smiled, and something inside her, a coil she hadn't even known, was clenched, unwound. There would still be fears, still be moments where the past tugged hard, still be nights when the wind outside mimicked old sounds and old wounds. But this was beginning, and beginnings, real ones, never need permission. They arrive in silence, in breath, in the space between a child's sleep and a dog's quiet choosing. Elena didn't linger long. She rose slowly, pressing one kiss to Mira's temple, letting her hand hover a moment over Kyros's back, not touching, just close. Then she walked upstairs again, and behind her, by the fire, two shapes remained. One girl still dreaming, and one guardian finally resting, not broken, not fixed, but becoming. The air was thin with winter's parting breath, not yet spring, but no longer January's grip either. The snow had softened at the edges, turned powder into crust, and the trees no longer groaned under their weight. They simply stood, waiting, like they knew change was coming but weren't ready to speak it aloud. Elena zipped up her jacket and glanced down the trail. Kyros stood beside her, off-leash. It was the first time. She could still feel the weight of the lead in her empty palm, a phantom rope, a safety line not tied to bone, but to fear. But she hadn't brought it, not this time. Kyros looked up at her, ears twitching once. His body was still but not rigid, just attentive, like he knew something mattered here, and he was waiting for her to decide how much. Elena crouched slightly, voice low. "We stay together, okay? No commands, no obedience drills, just a sentence, a request." Kyros blinked once, and then, without cue, started forward, steps slow, deliberate. Elena followed. The trail behind their farmhouse wound through a narrow forest ridge, silent in the way only snow-covered places can be. Every footfall was a hush, every branch a witness. They walked like that for 20 minutes. No leash, no force, just rhythm. Birdsong flitted in the distance. Mira's gloves were still in Elena's pocket, forgotten again, though Mira had drawn Kyros's forest in her notebook that morning, complete with cartoon squirrels and a speech bubble that said, "I'm learning trees now." Elena smiled at the thought. She glanced up ahead. Kyros was sniffing along a fallen log, ears alert, tail high, not rigid, but engaged, curious, free. It was the most alive she'd seen him, until he bolted. It wasn't a slow acceleration. There was no warning growl, no glance back. Just a sudden explosion of motion, fur flashing through the brush, paws breaking snow, body slicing through trees like he was chasing something ancient. "Kyros!" The name tore from her before she could stop it. Panic was instant, primal, the kind that clamped your ribs before logic could argue. She ran a few steps forward, then stopped, calling again. "Kyros, come!" No answer. The woods swallowed his shadow whole. Elena's breath came in clouds, now fast, uneven. She scanned the trees. Nothing. Just silence. The kind that didn't comfort. Her boots slipped slightly on a patch of ice, hands trembling as she reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. She was about to yell again when something flickered in her memory. A drawing. One Mira had left on the kitchen table, half finished. Kyros in the trees, eyes calm. And beside him, not a leash, not a human, but a light. And she remembered Mira's words just days ago, when Kyros had followed her silently from room to room. "He knows the way. He's just checking if we do, too." Elena lowered the phone. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since he vanished into the woods, she listened. To the forest, to her breath, to the memory of a dog who had once chosen violence, and now maybe was choosing something else. Then a bark, sharp, urgent, not hostile, but calling. Elena spun, heart leaping. "Kyros!" Another bark. Then movement. A flurry of snow. A shadow. And then she saw him. Kyros stood at the edge of a ravine halfway down the slope, front paws planted, body angled. He barked again, head turned toward something she couldn't yet see. She ran. Snow bit at her legs. Branches clawed her coat, but she didn't care. She skidded to a halt beside him, and then gasped. Below them, partially buried in slush and fallen branches, was a body, a man, face pale, jacket torn, bare hands splayed against the ground, unconscious. Elena dropped to her knees. "Oh, my God!" She fumbled for her phone again this time, signal. Weak, but real. She called emergency services, voice trembling, relaying coordinates as best she could. Kyros didn't move from his post. He stood guard, not barking now, but watchful, present. One paw near the man's shoulder, ears flicking. When two male paramedics arrived, trudging through snow with equipment packs and urgency, Kyros stepped in front of Elena tense. She held up her hand. "Easy, boy. They're here to help." He didn't growl, didn't lunge, just watched. Then, after a long pause, he stepped aside. They carried the man up the ridge. As the stretcher disappeared through the trees, Elena turned to Kyros, breath catching in her throat. "You didn't just remember," she whispered. "You chose." And for the first time, as she reached out, slowly, deliberately, Kyros leaned forward and pressed his head lightly into her palm. The man's face was nearly the same color as the snow, pale, crusted with frost along the brow. His lips had turned bluish-gray, cracked at the edges. One arm lay stretched awkwardly beneath him, the other half buried in a shallow drift. He wasn't shivering anymore, and that terrified Elena. People only stop shivering when the cold has taken hold too deep. She dropped beside him, knees hitting the snow. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. His chest rose barely, but it was enough. Still alive. Kyros stood a half-step away, silent, steady. One front paw hovered just above the man's shoulder, ears flicked forward like antennae locked on some invisible frequency. He leaned in and nudged the man once, not rough, not fearful, just urging. Alina tapped the emergency line again. This time, signal was stronger. 2 bars. She gave her coordinates, the terrain, the state of the hiker. Her voice was steady now, clearer. Focus had taken over. Training. Yes, adult male, estimated mid-30s, hypothermic, pulse shallow but present, breathing irregular. She didn't mention the dog. Not yet. Didn't have to. Kyros never left the man's side. Alina shed her outer jacket and tucked it under the man's back, lifting his head slightly. She knew enough not to move him too much. His core temperature had to be stabilized gradually. Kyros whined, low and uncertain. Alina looked over at him. "I know," she whispered, "but we found him. That's what matters." Minutes passed like hours. The wind picked up again, rattling dry branches overhead. Flakes drifted down in lazy spirals, some catching in Kyros's fur. He didn't shake them off. His eyes never left the man's chest, tracking each weak rise and fall like it was the only thing tethering them to hope. Then a crackle of static, a distant shout. Alina stood, waving one arm. "We're here!" 2 paramedics emerged through the trees, snow crunching under their boots, oxygen tank packs strapped tight, their neon jackets flashing like flares against the white. One of them, a younger man with a trimmed beard and tired eyes, slowed as he saw Kyros. "Ma'am, is the dog—" "He's fine," Alina said quickly. "He found the hiker. He won't interfere." The other medic, older, nodded. "Let's work fast." They knelt, assessed vitals, started wrapping the man in foil blankets, checking extremities. One prepped a warming IV, the other monitored oxygen saturation. Kyros shifted, not away. Closer. The younger paramedic flinched. Alina raised her hand. "Kyros." He froze, not growling, not stiff with threat, just still, watching, listening. "Let them help," Alina said, her voice low but firm. "We've done our part." The dog blinked. Then, almost imperceptibly, he stepped back. But he stayed close. The medics moved quickly now, easing the man onto a collapsible stretcher, strapping him in, lifting him up. Only when they began retreating back through the trees did Kyros let out a sound, a soft, breathy whoof, as if exhaling something ancient, something released. Alina laid a hand on his back. He didn't flinch. "You stayed," she murmured. "That's all anyone ever needed from you." They stood there in the quiet, a woman and a war-torn dog, in a half-melted forest, after saving a life no one else would have found in time. Snow continued to fall, gentle now, not erasing footprints, but honoring them. The fire crackled in its hearth, sending soft shadows dancing across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the snow was melting slowly, reluctantly, but inside, warmth had found a foothold. Mira sat at the low table near the window, colored pencils scattered like petals around her. Her brow furrowed with concentration, her small hand moving deliberately across the page. She didn't hum today, just breathed quietly, her focus tethered to the paper. Elina watched her from the kitchen, one hand wrapped around a mug gone cold. Kyros lay a few feet away, head resting between his paws, eyes open, awake, alert but still. His chest rose and fell in even rhythm. He had been like that since they returned. No pacing, no circling, just grounded. Every so often he blinked. Elina wasn't sure what stirred more in her, awe or gratitude. Mira lifted the paper gently and carried it over, barefoot, on the wooden floor. She held it out without a word. Elina took it. The drawing was simple but precise. On one side of the page, a man lying in the snow, wrapped in silver blankets. On the other side, Kyros sitting beside him, not in command, not postured for attack, just there, his tail curled gently, his body relaxed, his gaze focused. It wasn't a scene of action. It was a scene of choice. Mira tugged Elena's sleeve. He didn't have to, right? Elina looked down at her daughter, then at the dog still quiet, still watching. No, she said softly. He didn't have to. Mira nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. He didn't do it because someone told him. He wanted to. That's different. Elina knelt to meet her eye level. Yes, that's very different. She looked at Kyros again. The muscles along his shoulders had softened since the rescue. There was no tension in his paws, no guarded expression, just a dog at rest. And yet, the part of him that had once been trained to obey, to respond to orders without hesitation, it hadn't disappeared. It had waited. Dormant, perhaps, but not dead. He remembered, Elina said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. But he didn't revert. He chose. Mira leaned against her side, quiet for a moment. Do you think he misses it? Being told what to do? Elina shook her head. I think he misses being useful, but not in the way people expected. A silence settled between them, not heavy, just full, like the air right before spring breaks through frost. He didn't bark, Mira added. Not even when they touched the man. That means something, right? Elina smiled. It means he knew what mattered. She stood, placing the drawing on the mantel next to the ceramic paw print they'd made a few weeks ago. It belonged now, not as a trophy, but as a marker of a turning point. Kyros watched her. His ears didn't flick, his eyes didn't dart, and slowly, as if drawn by something invisible but certain, he stood up. He crossed the room with quiet steps and stopped in front of Mira. Then, for the first time, he pressed the side of his head gently against her shoulder. Mira didn't gasp. She didn't even move. She just closed her eyes. Elina felt her throat tighten, not with fear, with something much older, much more sacred. Trust, she realized, is never loud. It's in the soft weight of a gesture like this. Mira opened her eyes and looked up. He's not waiting for permission anymore. Elina nodded. Because he finally knows, she whispered, that his instincts aren't dangerous. They're his, and they matter. And in that farmhouse, as dusk stretched long shadows across the walls, a girl, her mother, and a once-lost dog sat in silence. No one gave orders. No one asked for tricks. And yet everything had changed. The power died with a sigh. Not a crack, not a pop, just a slow, creeping silence that swallowed the farmhouse room by room. The refrigerator gave one last hum and went still. Overhead lights flickered once, then surrendered. Only the fire remained, flickering low in the stone hearth like a breath held between heartbeats. Outside, the wind howled across the fields like it had teeth. Trees groaned. Branches scraped against windows like fingers testing for weakness. Alina lit the emergency lanterns one by one. A soft glow pooled around the hearth, the shadows stretching longer, now gentler too. Mira sat curled beneath a patchwork quilt, her legs tucked under her like a cat, holding a warm mug of peppermint tea. Kyros paced, not frantically, but with a tension Alina hadn't seen in weeks. His nails clicked softly on the wooden floor, moving from corner to door, back to the window, then again. Every gust of wind made his ears twitch. The house, without its steady hum of electronics, sounded ancient-like. It was remembering things best left forgotten. "He's not scared," Mira said gently. "He just doesn't know where to be." Alina looked at the dog. His eyes weren't wild, but they were searching and searching and searching. She knew that feeling. The disorientation of silence, the weight of stillness that felt louder than noise. For those who had lived on edge like Kyros had, like so many veterans she'd treated calm, wasn't peace. Sometimes it was just the moment before everything went wrong. Mira shifted on the rug, then unfolded a small fleece blanket, light blue with a stitched yellow sun in one corner. She laid it carefully beside her. No commands, no coaxing, just a quiet invitation. "If he wants," she whispered, and she said nothing more. Kyros paused mid-pace, his body angled toward the door, like muscle memory was pulling him toward patrol. But he didn't move. He just stood still, the light from the fire catching on the lighter hairs along his spine. Minutes passed, then more. Mira rested her cheek on her knees, half asleep, half waiting. Alina sat behind them both, watching not as a therapist tonight, not even as a mother, just a witness. And then a shift. Kyros turned, not all at once. It was subtle. The way his front paw turned slightly inward, the way his tail dropped, not in fear, but in letting go. He stepped forward once, then again, and then, without drama or hesitation, he lowered himself onto the blanket Mira had laid down, not curled, not guarded. He simply rested, one paw stretched just enough to almost touch Mira's. Alina didn't speak. She didn't have to. In that moment, in the low hush of a powerless night, trust wasn't built through thunder or trauma or triumph. It was built here in the decision to lie down beside someone and believe nothing bad would happen. The storm outside roared, but in the farmhouse there was only breathing. 3 heartbeats, 1 fire, no fear. The first light of dawn crept in slowly, tentative as a memory long buried. It didn't flood the room, not yet. It tiptoed across the floorboards, brushing the rug, the hearth, and finally reaching the 2 figures near the fire. Mira had shifted sometime in the night. Her arm now dangled over the side of the blanket. Her cheek rested against her shoulder, mouth slightly open, breathing deep and even. And beside her, not quite touching, but so close it almost didn't matter, was Kyros, curled tightly, ears flicking at every creak the old house made, eyes open, awake. But he wasn't patrolling. He wasn't guarding. He was staying, still, present, close. Alina stood quietly in the hallway, wrapped in a shawl. She hadn't slept much, but she hadn't needed to. There was something about that night, its silence, its honesty, that made rest feel like it had already happened. She didn't move, didn't even reach for her phone to capture it. Some things aren't meant to be frozen in pixels. Some things are meant to be witnessed. The fire had burned low, nothing left but a gentle orange glow in the embers. No one had spoken for hours. And yet, Elena had never felt more in conversation with life, with healing, with the quiet process of rebuilding a soul. Kyros shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing the edge of Mira's blanket. He didn't pull away, and Mira didn't wake. It was a new kind of trust, Elena thought. Not the dramatic, movie scene kind, but the kind that breathes in inches, that tiptoes instead of declaring, that shows up not with barks or gestures but with stillness. She could almost hear her own heartbeat, and somewhere inside her deep, past the clinical knowledge, the checklists, the caution that had ruled so many of her decisions, she felt it. This was working, not perfectly, not quickly, but genuinely. Mira stirred slightly and murmured something in her sleep. Kyros's ears perked, but he didn't rise. He just blinked and stayed. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was earned. Elena remembered something one of her old professors once said. Connection isn't always forged through touch or speech. Sometimes it's just the courage to stay close enough. And Kyros was close enough. To feel the warmth, to share the space, to know, without needing to be told that he belonged here now, that no one was reaching for a leash, that no command was coming, that this home didn't want anything from him but his presence. Elena leaned against the doorway, letting the moment stretch, letting the morning unfold without interruption. She didn't whisper encouragement, didn't praise, didn't record. She just watched, because sometimes silence is sacred. And on that morning, a dog who once flinched at breath, who once growled at footsteps, who once refused to be seen without baring his teeth, chose to stay. Not because he had to, but because he could. The storm had passed. Not in a grand sweep of sunlight or birdsong, but in the quiet way the world resets itself after being reminded of its own fragility. Tree branches lay like forgotten arms across the gravel road. Ice melted from fence posts in slow tears. And inside the farmhouse, something else had shifted, something not so easily seen. Kyros had started to move. Not in the old patterns, not from corner to corner like a patrolling sentinel, and not with the wary tension of a creature expecting attack. He moved with them. When Mira fetched a book, Kyros followed softly, tail low but steady. When Elena stirred her tea at the kitchen table, she glanced down and noticed him lying beneath her chair, not for protection, not for commands, but for nearness. It wasn't dramatized. It wasn't loud. It was presence. It was the beginning of belonging. One afternoon, as Elena typed notes for a patient report, her right hand slipped from the armrest of the chair, fingers dangling in thought. Kyros was there. No warning, no bark, no permission asked. He simply stepped forward and placed his head beneath her palm, and then stood still. Her fingers curled, almost without thought, into the thick fur between his ears. He didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But her throat tightened in a way that told her something important had just been spoken, even if no words had passed between them. It wasn't about obedience. This wasn't the product of repetition or reward. There had been no command, no treat, no expectation. It was an invitation. Kyros, once trained to wait for instruction, to read every gesture as a precursor to action, now simply asked for contact not as duty, but as choice. Mira walked by with a crayon tucked behind her ear, notebook under her arm. She paused mid-step and smiled at the sight, her mother's hand resting gently on the head of the dog who used to hide from touch. "He likes the sound of the keys," she said casually. "When you type." Elena blinked. "He does?" Mira nodded. "It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat that tells him where you are." Kyros blinked up at Elena, eyes calm, still alert, always alert, but not in panic, just present. There were still shadows. That much was clear. He still startled at the slam of the back gate, still avoided mirrors, still paused too long when the wind howled too close to the pitch of a scream. But now he came back faster. He checked the room not to escape, but to reassure himself. He followed not to control, but to belong. That evening, as Mira lay on the floor with her drawings scattered like confetti around her, Kyros stretched out beside her. He didn't curl. He sprawled back legs, kicked slightly out, jaw resting on the corner of her sketch pad. And when Mira giggled because his nose smeared the pencil lines, he didn't move away. Elena watched from the doorway, one hand pressed over her mouth, not in fear, but in awe. The hardest part of healing, she had learned over the years, wasn't breaking down the walls. It was teaching the body it was safe enough to lower them. And for a creature built to respond to threat, trained to anticipate violence, conditioned to live in tension, this was as sacred as a prayer. A resting body, an unguarded head, a choice to stay. The sun dipped low, casting a golden haze across the hardwood. Kyros turned his face toward it, his eyes closed just briefly. And in the slow movement of shadow and light, Elena saw it. He was no longer haunted. Not entirely, not always, not in this house, not with them. The shelter looked smaller than Elena remembered, not in size, but in the way places shrink once fear fades. Kyros didn't tug, pace, or freeze as they approached. He stood steady beside 10-year-old Mira, who held his leash gently, like a ribbon from a story only they shared. Inside, whispers rose. "That can't be the same dog. Is that Kyros?" A name once said, as warning now softened, almost reverent. Kyros crossed the threshold, step by deliberate step, choosing to enter. The air seemed to change. Mira whispered, "It's okay." He kept walking. Elena needed no notes as she faced the room. "I wasn't looking for a dog," she began. "And he wasn't looking for anyone. But maybe we found something we didn't know we'd lost." She spoke of trauma not as something to fix, but to understand. "I'm a trauma therapist, but it wasn't my training that reached him. It was my daughter's patience, her quiet drawings left by his bowl, her willingness to sit without expecting anything." Kyros never barked or bared teeth at Mira. A man asked, "How did you know he was safe?" "I didn't," Elena said. "Not fully. But I knew he was trying. And sometimes trying is the most sacred form of trust." Trish, the staff member, added, "I remember when we brought him in, chained, starving, bit through a tech's glove. We prepared for euthanasia, but we waited, just in case." She looked at Kyros. "And I've never been more grateful for time." Kyros turned, meeting Trish's gaze, not recognition, but acknowledgement. She wiped a tear. Families left with glances, nods, tentative smiles. Kyros stood beside Mira, no longer a cautionary tale, but a story of return. Later, during a break, volunteers, staff, and trainers gathered. One skeptical woman said, I rehab dogs with e-collars and dominance. It works. I'm not here to replace your method, Elena replied, just to share mine. Another asked, You called aggression armor. What did you mean? When Kyros came in, his behaviors weren't hostility, they were grief, hardened, fear that learned to bite first. The skeptic said, Fear doesn't excuse a mauling. No, Elena agreed, but understanding it changes how we respond. Kyros wasn't trying to harm. He was surviving. She drew a triangle. Behavior, need, memory at its points. I didn't try to fix him. We offered presence showing up without agenda, choice no forcing, and consistency same tone, same gestures. Trauma thrives on unpredictability. Trust is the opposite. How long before he lets you touch him? 31 days. Not to pet him, just to rest beside us. And now? He's honest. He doesn't fake comfort, doesn't obey from fear. That's the healthiest I've seen him. Mira added, soft but clear. He didn't need to be fixed. He needed to be safe enough to be broken. A young couple stayed after. The woman asked quietly, Do you think a dog like that can ever really be safe? Mira answered first. He's not safe because we controlled him. He's safe because we listened. Elena echoed, Safety isn't the absence of risk. It's the presence of understanding. The man asked, What if something goes wrong? Something always might, Elena said. What matters is how we respond. When he growled at Mira, we stepped back, learned why. Over time, those reasons loosened their grip. The woman said, We were told dogs with bite history are too dangerous. It can be dangerous, Elena said. But so is leaving them behind. Mira added, He didn't bite because he was bad. He bit because no one heard him until it was too late. The couple left, quiet but changed. Elena sat beside Mira and Kyros, who lay with his chin on Mira's boot, at peace. Outside, the birch trees rustled. Inside, Kyros exhaled, the sound of gravel softening into dust. The morning sky was pale gold, soft with early spring. Puddles in the parking lot reflected the light like tiny mirrors. Inside the rural shelter, folding chairs creaked as familiar faces gathered. Trish, in a new blazer, adjusted the taped microphone at the podium. Elena sat near the back, Kyros at her side, still, alert, peaceful. Mira stood at the front, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. She'd worn it for Trish, who'd once whispered, "Let's just see," that day at the kennel. Volunteers were recognized. Fosters, socializers, helpers. Then Trish announced one last award, Junior Companion and Recovery Assistant, Mira Carter. Mira hesitated, then stepped forward, quiet but steady. Kyros watched her, a silent escort of trust. Trish knelt, handing her the certificate. "This is for the silence you gave to a dog who needed it more than words." Mira took it gently, hid it under her jacket like a secret. "Do you want to hang it at home?" Elena asked. Mira shook her head. "I want to put it in his box." The one by the fireplace scrapped drawings, a bell, a soft rope toy, reminders of beginnings. Later, behind the farmhouse, Mira and Elena planted a sapling. Mira pressed its roots with care. "He deserves shade that doesn't lean." "Then we'll plant it strong," Elena said. Kyros sat nearby, untethered, calm. Mira drew him under the imagined tree, leaving out his scars. "He doesn't need them here," she said. The breeze carried birdsong. Kyros dozed, unguarded. "Do you think he knows it's home now?" Mira asked. "I think he stopped looking for the exit," Elena said. At the shelter again, Kyros walked in, not to revisit the past, but to help another through theirs. He sat outside kennels, offering calm, not commands. A bark softened. A trembling paused. A wild young shepherd sat, unprompted. The staff whispered, awed. "That's not training," Elena said. "That's co-regulation. Dogs do it better than we ever could." Kyros approached a puppy, just a nod of his head, and the bark stopped, curiosity replacing fear. "He's the quiet part of a song," Mira said. "He's the rest between the notes," Elena added. Trish approached. "Could he visit once a week, just be here?" Elena smiled. "It's not a job. It's a role he's choosing." Kyros licked Mira's hand. From forgotten to foundation. And in that quiet, among fearful dogs and hope rekindling, Kyros didn't just find rescue. He found legacy. The spring wind rolled in slow, warm gusts through the screen door. It carried the scent of apple blossoms and damp soil, of firewood too old to burn clean, and the soft stir of life rebuilt. From the worn porch, Elena watched Mira tumble across the backyard barefoot, laughing, hair loose and glowing in the late morning light. She wasn't chasing anything, just moving, just alive. Kyros lay beneath the apple tree they had planted together, front paws crossed. His ears tracked Mira lazily, tail tapping the earth like a quiet drum line. Not alert, not guarding, just there, present. That rhythm, that tail's tap. Something about it cracked open a drawer in Elena's memory. She blinked, and the world shifted, back to the shelter. Gray walls, sharp smells, the buzz of fluorescent lights flickering overhead like impatient thought. That cage. She hadn't wanted to stop. She was only there because Mira had tugged her sleeve, because Mira had paused, eyes fixed on a creature crouched in the shadows of a steel enclosure. Kyros had not growled. Not at first. He had stared, unblinking, flat-eyed. Not with curiosity, but calculation. His body was coiled like a question with no good answer. One wrong move, and the question would ask itself in teeth. And yet Mira, tiny, silent Mira, hadn't recoiled. She had knelt beside the bars, close enough for Elena's therapist instincts to riot, but far enough that no protocols were breached. She had simply looked at him and whispered, "He doesn't hate us. He just doesn't think we're real yet." It had unnerved her, how precisely Mira had seen what no case file captured. Back then, Kyros was not a dog to pet, not a creature you coaxed with treats or baby talk. He was pain, encased in instinct. He was not safe. Even Trish, the woman who loved every lost soul in that building, had said so plainly. Some dogs don't come back. Some stay behind even after you open the cage. And yet, Elena had stayed that day. Just stayed. Now. She blinked back into the present. The porch creaked under her weight as she leaned forward. Kyros had not moved from beneath the apple tree. Mira danced near him, twirling a stick in the air like a ribbon. He didn't flinch. His chest rose and fell with the wind. His tail still tapped. Elena swallowed hard. The difference between then and now wasn't measured in behavior charts or milestones. It was something softer. She stepped off the porch and walked toward him, slowly, reverently, like approaching an altar. Kyros lifted his head at the sound, but there was no tension in his jaw, no freeze in his spine. She knelt beside him and rested a hand gently on his back. He didn't look. He didn't have to. That, too, was a kind of trust. She looked at Mira, spinning free under the open sky. At Kyros, grounded and content beneath a tree they had planted in silence and hope. And she thought about cages, not just the metal ones, but the invisible ones, the ones built from fear, from abandonment, from words like aggressive, damaged, and not adoptable. And she thought about how some cages aren't opened with keys, but with presence, with time, with choice, with a child who drew suns and hearts and tiny paw prints beside food bowls no one else dared approach. Elena pressed her forehead to Kyros's neck, the fur warm and sun-drenched. "You came back to us," she whispered. Kyros exhaled, a sound almost too soft to name. But Elena understood it anyway. The breeze had settled now. Only the soft rustle of the apple tree's young leaves stirred the quiet. Elena sat cross-legged in the grass beside Kyros, her hand resting gently on his back. She didn't stroke to soothe him. He no longer needed that. She touched him the way one might touch a book long closed and finally understood. Kyros lay still, but not in tension. His breath was steady, and his eyes half closed, not asleep, not guarding. Just being. Elena's fingers curled slightly in his fur, feeling the coarseness of age and survival woven into it. Beneath her hand was a body shaped by command, by discipline, by pain. But now there was something else there, a looseness, a weight surrendered. Her voice was barely above a breath when she spoke. "You weren't dangerous. You were dismissed." Kyros didn't move. Not at first. But his ears shifted toward her, as if tuning into a frequency only spoken in truths. She paused, watching him, then leaned closer, her forehead nearly grazing his shoulder. "They didn't see you. Not really. They saw the part of you that scared them, not the part that was scared." The words lingered in the air between them, raw, unfiltered, not meant for reassurances, but release. Kyros lifted his head slowly. His eyes met hers. Not challenging, not questioning, just witnessing. There was no obedience in the gesture, only presence, only trust earned without command. Elena exhaled. She thought back to the reports, clinical, cold, so certain in their condemnation. Displays persistent aggression toward men. Fails to respond to positive reinforcement. Likely neurologically compromised from field trauma. Unadoptable. They were checkboxes, not stories, not scars, not soul. She had believed some of it too, at the start. She had told herself she was only observing, that this wasn't a commitment, that her daughter's quiet fascination was temporary. But Mira had known. Before the therapy sessions, before the case file, before the cage even opened, Mira had seen him. Elena reached into her pocket and unfolded a piece of paper, worn at the creases. One of Mira's first drawings. Kyros, under a tree, alone but not angry. A little girl in the corner, watching, not petting, not holding, just there. She placed it gently beside his paw. "You didn't need to be fixed," she whispered. "You just needed room." Kyros blinked slowly, then turned his gaze outward toward the wide stretch of grass, the old wooden fence, the open world he once saw only through steel bars. He wasn't curled like before, with his back to the room and his eyes on the exit. He was stretched long, belly to the earth, heart unarmored. And Elena, therapist, mother, once skeptic, finally allowed herself to see the truth she hadn't known how to name. Kyros hadn't failed their systems. Their systems had failed him. She brushed her hand once more down his back. You were never the problem. There was no wag, no lick, no dramatic cue to mark the moment. Just breath, just stillness, just a once-lost soul, finally given permission to stop surviving and start belonging. The apple tree had bloomed. Its slender branches reached upward like fingers learning how to stretch for the first time. White petals fluttered gently in the breeze, some catching in Mira's curls, some landing on Kyros's fur like blessings too soft to feel. They sat together in the hush of spring. No rush, no noise. Just a quilt on the grass, the scent of new life, and the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken. Mira drew with her knees tucked up, a pencil smudging softly across her sketch pad. Her brow furrowed, not in frustration, but in concentration, the way children do when they're not drawing something, but someone. Kyros lay between them, not curled tight like the first night, not poised or ready, just there. His body stretched long, one ear flicking lazily at a passing fly, his chest rising and falling in slow, full breaths. He didn't guard. He didn't watch the perimeter. He simply rested in the space between a mother's stillness and a daughter's wonder. Elena leaned back against the tree trunk, head tilted toward the sky. Her eyes were closed, but her awareness was wide open. Every shift of grass, every stroke of Mira's pencil, every soft exhale from Kyros registered somewhere deep in her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was managing anything. She was part of it. A family made not from blood or plans or clean beginnings, but from patience, from earned glances, from 1,000 silent agreements built in the space where language fails and presence begins. A gust of wind scattered a few blossoms across the quilt. Mira reached out and gently placed one on Kyros's paw. He didn't flinch. "He likes it here," she whispered, eyes still on her drawing. Elena opened her eyes and looked over. "I think we all do." They watched the petals dance in the grass, watched Kyros shift, and let out a low, rumbling sigh, not distressed, not alert, just content. Elena didn't reach for him, not today. She didn't need to, because healing had never been about taming the broken or fixing the wild. It had never been about making Kyros safe enough to keep. It had been about seeing him, and in return, being seen. There were still shadows inside him. She knew that. Trauma doesn't vanish. It learns where to rest. But the dog between them now wasn't the same creature from the reports, the cage, the whispered warnings. This Kyros had found something those reports never measured. Choice, belonging, quiet. Mira turned her sketch pad around, holding it toward her mom. "It's us," she said. Elena smiled. There they were, beneath the tree. A girl, a dog, a woman. No leashes, no labels. Just a triangle of connection. And in the middle of it, the space where they all fit. She reached out and touched Mira's knee, then glanced at Kyros. He looked up, just once. And in that look was everything. Not submission, not command, just understanding. "You're not ours," Elena murmured. But you chose to stay, and that means more. Kyros blinked, slow, calm, complete. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes sang from the farmhouse porch, not loud, not urgent, just a gentle echo of a life that had finally, quietly, made room. Not every dog needs a command. Some just need a chance to be heard. Kyros was never broken. He was buried under labels, under fear, under all the things people thought he should be. But with time, choice, and quiet love, he wasn't fixed. He was found. This story isn't just about a German shepherd once feared. It's about what happens when we stop trying to control and start choosing to connect. Mira didn't tame him. Elena didn't train him. They simply saw him and waited long enough for him to believe it. For anyone watching who has ever felt overlooked, misunderstood, or told they were too much, you're not alone. Healing doesn't always bark. Sometimes it lies in the sun, beneath an apple tree, with no leash and no fear. So today we honor every dog waiting in a shelter, every child with a sketchbook and a quiet gift, every soul who chooses to stay, not because they were forced to, but because they were loved into safety. And to the German shepherds of the world, like Kyros, thank you for reminding us that being enough has nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with trust.